So we touched briefly upon doing certain outcrosses, specifically with true breeding varietals. So I wanted to segue into what are some of your foundational strains you like to use to make crosses?
So some of the first stuff I was ever given in the 90s was some Afghani-based stuff. We had one, my buddy had one he called Dirt, and he had crossed it with this Big Bud, which was kind of a different Big Bud than I don't think it's the Big Bud from Amsterdam. So there, I had that Dirt Big Bud I got from him in like 94, and one that he called Dirt Perp. So it was like Dirt was this one Afghani, and then Perp was this other thing that turns out was like a Burmese indica, they called it, but it's Burmese Afghani, Burmese Paki, something like that. And so I had that. That was the first stuff I ever got. Had that for a while. The Northern Lights we had from 89, and that wound up in a lot of stuff, some of it in a roundabout way, coming back from other people that we gave it to. And then so Dirt Big Bud, Dirt Perp, Northern Lights, and then I got the stuff that I made the lime out of, which was a Northern Lights Burmese Afghani cross. And that was kind of in the 90s. Those were most of the stuff I had. I had some White Widow too that wound up like in the Grape Soda Skunk. I got that in 96. And then in the early 2000s, I wound up with this Black Affy that was really killer. Big, huge broadleafs like this. Really pretty color in the fall, turned black and red and blue. And then around that same time, I got another couple Afghanis, one called Big Blue and one called Big Red. Both came from the same guy, and that's how he named things. And one of them, when fall hit, it was just like indigo blue leaves. That was the Big Blue. And the other one, when the cold hit in the fall, it turned just red or purple. But mostly like a lot of it was more of a redder purple, and the Big Blue was more of a bluer purple. Big Red was more of a big, tall plant for that kind of broadleaf Afghani. Like it would get, 8 or 9 feet tall. The Big Blue was hard to get more than like 4 feet tall, 6 feet tall at the biggest.
Real squat.
Really squat, really slow growing. Buds that were so hard, like you couldn't believe it. When it was dry, it was just totally rock hard. Like you could step on it and it wouldn't flatten. It would still just get a little flat spot on it. You know what I mean?
Damn.
Really, really dense. And then those were kind of, all that stuff was a lot of what I had at that point. And all through there, I had crossed those with other stuff. I had other things that came and went. Those were the ones that I really liked out of all the stuff that I ever had. There's maybe a couple in there I'm forgetting. But I started breeding those with other things. So I took the Black Affy, I bred it with Purple Urkel, I bred it with Hindu Kush. I took those crosses after I made them. I bred them with that Hollywood Pure Kush, that really gnarly OG type. And that I got around 2004, 2005. Those Afghanis I probably got 2002, 2003, Right around then I got one called Candelabra from the same people who I got the Big Blue and the Big Red from. That wound up in the Cherry West. That's like that crazy smell with all the different wild stuff in it. Pine and turpentine and like fierce grape, Gatorade, like all kinds of stuff in it. And then right around in there, 2004, somewhere in there, we got the Sour Diesel. So then I had like the PK Hindu Affy and the PK Hindu Urkel, or the PK the PK Urkel Black Affy, excuse me. And then I took those and those wound up getting crossed with the sour diesel. One of those became what I call Jarro, and the PK Hindu Affy I also put on Headband, and that was what was root beer. So those are both really close. And then, you know, the stuff that the black lime was made out of a couple things. The one I mentioned earlier, plus one that was mostly our Northern Lights crossed with Oaxacan Afghani, and those wound up making black lime. I crossed that with the Hollywood Pure Kush. That wound up making Lime 1 and Lime Pop and all that stuff. And so I think about 2009, and then in 2010, that was when I got initially like some cherry pie bag seeds from Mike Measy. Mm-hmm. And then I got the Animal Cookies clone. I think that was early 2010 maybe. And so most of the stuff that I have is all those things bred together in different ways, back crossing to this plant, going over to that one, mixing them together. And then out of all those things I made from all those, I take those and I cross them to whatever seems interesting, you know. So I make a lot of different things. Lime crossed with all kinds of different stuff, Jarro crossed with all kinds of different stuff. And then the lime crossed with the cherry pie is cherry limeade, cross that with different things. The dirt perp and the dirt big bud are both in the pina. So that's those are like the real base of most of the stuff that I work with.
One question I always had was, what's up with that Woodman Canyon oil can? Isn't that in the black lime?
So that is what the Northern Lights Oaxacan Afghani is.
Okay.
So the Oaxacan Afghani cross that was out there in Woodman is what a guy who I worked for called the oil can. And he had two different kinds. One of them was the oil can and one was the Stoil. And when it smelled like the Stoil, he liked it. And that was more of a turpentine thing from the Oaxacan side. Mm-hmm. And when it smelled like that oil can from the Afghani side, he didn't like it. And back then there was nobody in Cali really knew about, this was like 96, 95, 97. Nobody really knew about like the allure of gassy weed. Like, so like gassy skunky weed or oniony or garlicky was like so common that it was like, everybody wanted something that smelled like raspberry or grape or orange or something special that was like fruity or more unique, because that all that kind of stuff was just kind of common with all the Afghani
It's coming from Amsterdam too. Like that was a lot of like the fruity stuff is coming from Amsterdam too.
Well, the Amsterdam fruits too are a little bit different. Like we had a lot of fruits that were more like true fruit, like without the Amsterdam-y smell. The Amsterdam-y's that kind of, a lot of it is kind of like a little bit washed out and like I don't know, like muted in weird ways, you know. And some of that's kind of cool, like it's like dusty candy kind of smells, or like what Fletch from Archive calls chalky, you know. It's like sometimes it's good and a lot of times it's not. But we had a lot of stuff that was like really special fruits, and so like the Dirt Big Bud was like bubblegum grape, like really nice, you know. So there was all these different things that were killer like that. And so the oil can was like this kind of derogatory term for this throw that came out of the Oaxacan Afghani.
That's what he named it. So the guy up there.
Well, that's I used to trim for him, and I'd pull him out a couple buds. Like, hey, you know, I found this one for you. It'd be like the prettiest purple weed, and sometimes he'd smell it and go, oh yeah, the Stoil, which comes from this cleaner called Less Toil, which to me smells nothing like this stuff smells. It smells like turpentine to me, but people thought it smelled like this Less Toil, so they called it Stoil. And I would pull it out for him, and he'd be like, no, that's oil can. And I was like, oh, okay.
It was purple too.
It's purple. Yeah. It's really, really cool plants. The ones that lean towards the Oaxacan would be the tall, green, big, huge spears, chemical smells, turpentine, a little more pointy. really big and branchy. And then the Afghani was like short and more purple and would get all the way dark, really beautiful, covered in frost, like really frosty, like kind of like cookies type look, you know? But then you had all the ones in between. So I would see that look and I would be like, ooh, this one. And if it was the one that had taken on the wrong smell, he'd be like, no. So anyway, when I finally, he was going to give me a bunch of seeds. He had like a pound of seeded weed he was going to give me. And I was super excited. And then they ended up getting busted, stopped growing. And I never got the seeds from them. But my buddy, we had worked for him and he had taken little popcorn buds off of the plants after hours. They were like, yeah, you can have that as long as you're not thinking about that while you're supposed to be working. Go back after hours and you can keep those little buds. We kept the little buds, and in the bottom of the bag, in a paper bag of little buds, like drying by the fireplace, there's these seeds. So he took them, our buddy bred them a couple times and gave them back to me, and they're all, this is that purple, orange, green from up there, you know? And I grew them, and there was none of the Stoil. And it was like all like, there was like some that were like marinara and not that good. And then there were some that were like oil can. So I tried to breed it towards the oil can because it was the best of what was there. And at this point, it's the early 2000s, and we're starting to get an idea that people like these kind of more acrid smells. And my buddy who had bred the oil can stuff from those essentially bag seeds, but they're paper bag seeds, kind of funny, you know? He loved that. He didn't like fruity weed. He didn't like sativas. He was like, I want sleepy, acrid indicas. So when he got them, he's like, I'm growing them. I don't know why you guys aren't all over this. But to us, because the guy who was growing it, he's like, that's not the good one. You want this one, you know? And we're like thinking we want this one that's more what now people would say is like kind of like Jack, but a little bit more complex. And so that was what those were. And you know, that I bred with that other thing that I said was the limey thing. They came together and that made the black lime. So it was like this really citrusy thing that lacked some potency, and this other thing that was the oil can one that was way too potent for a lot of people and really acrid. And when they came together, they made the really cool black lime thing.
Also, elaborate on when you found that phenotype of black lime. I remember you had a story behind when you found that pheno of black lime and how it was named.
Yeah, so I had the seed garden where it was just like, okay, there's all these ones that were the more citrusy thing, and then we had the oil can ones. And the thing about the oil can stuff was we had been giving that guy clones for years, and he had been breeding the oil can stuff to the Northern Lights. So it had been back crossed to the Northern Lights we had several times before we wound up with those paper bag seeds. So what ended up happening was when we grew those out, it was like, okay, well, we're only going to keep one male. Do we keep this one or that one? We're like, well, this one's really potent and it gets really thick buds consistently. This one over here is a little more wild, and a lot of times it gets these little narrow buds. So there was one plant that had these really narrow buds and these really little leaves, and when the cold hit, it just turned straight black with like a little bit of blue to it, but it was just like the one plant that got all the way black out of the whole garden. And so when I labeled them, they all got labeled with descriptions. That one smelled like lime and it turned black. So on the bag with all the seeds in it, I just wrote black lime because that was what plant that was. And then it stuck, you know, because it was just like, it sounded like a cool name.
It is a great name.
Yeah. So it was just lucky. It turns out there's a seasoning that's not a season. Well, it's kind of a seasoning, but they age these limes and they turn solid black, and they call it black lime. They use it a lot for cocktails and stuff, different foods. It's like a Middle Eastern thing.
So, and out of all these foundational strains, what do you think, I guess it's hard to say, but what's your favorite out of all those foundational strains?
The lime wound up being what I like to smoke the most. That black Affy, once I crossed it with the Hindu, made a thing that I really, really loved, and that's what comes through on the root beer as far as how it smokes and the flavor and all that. And So all said and done, like the lime and the jarro stuff that's kind of like root beer and the root beer itself, those are like my favorite ones. Like it's hard, if I have those, it's hard to smoke something else over them. Like I might, there's a lot of things I'll light up and take a couple pulls and put it out and then roll that instead. And if I smoke lime a lot, then then I start wanting to smoke the jarro or the root beer. And then if I smoke those a lot, then I'm like, oh, then I miss the lime. But I could go back and forth on those, and those are pretty
one
much
thing
it.
that always resonated with me, one thing you told me in person was how having smells that translate into taste.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me like the black lime kind of achieves that for you. It has a smell that translates to a taste and a flavor.
It does,
that you just love.
Yeah. And now, like these days, people understand that. But when we were first realizing that back in the day, people didn't even know, there was only a few people who understand what you meant, My buddy used to say, it translates, He'd be like, oh, that translates. And so he kind of taught me about like being like having more of an appreciation for those flavors. And so, like we were smoking things and tasting them and trying to find the ones where, and you smoke the joint way down and it still tastes good when it's a roach. You're like, whoa, that's still good. And now I think that's pretty generally understood, that when you smoke, you want it to really taste good and you want it to cut across. And, but like at the time, we were really on the hunt for that. And a lot of stuff was like, oh, it smells good, and you smoke it and it's just, and that was the thing about a lot of that Amsterdam stuff. You smell it and you think it's great, and you smoke it and it just, and a lot of it was because it didn't have enough oils in it. So it was like really frosty. And we learned pretty quick that things that look frosty, it doesn't mean it's good resin. But if you get something that has really good resin and it has that level of it being there, that's when it's like really good. And that's what, like when you're talking about that rainbow belts or things like that, it's like that's why those hit, because it's like, wow, they have the resin of something like a cookies, and then it's actually like really good.
What's the funniest thing is Jai from Cookies. He always says, if I can stick that shit to my forehead, that means it's gonna smoke good. But it's that oily, like that dense.
It's got to be sticky.
But he's just so funny because he's like, can I stick it to my forehead? But it's funny, like the Gary Payton, his flavor strain, just stick to your forehead. That rainbow belts, stick to your forehead. It's got that oily resin sticky, that's just gonna, when you smoke it, the oils are just gonna light up, coat your mouth with that flavor. Yeah,
and then it has a texture to the smoke too, where it's kind of like, it gets like kind of steamy and oily instead of just being like a dry, harsh smoke.
Kind of like the opposite side of the spectrum is like some of like the Granddaddy Purples and the Urkels are kind of like that dry resin. At least the Granddaddy Purple I remember was a little more like on the dry resin.
Yeah, good Urkel had a nice. It really would come through, but like the Granddaddy was a trippy one too, because when it really went into production, people were just busting it out, and a lot of it was like really, I think people weren't drying it good and they were pushing it, and it's full of stuff. And I think done good, it was good, but I think that's where a lot of the like when people say exotics, I think those are all like the grandchildren of Granddaddy and
100%.
And
it's funny how it used to be nothing but perp, then it went to Kush. And now everybody's going back to these purple strains that nobody wanted because, so it's funny how the market is now.